The truck driver named Russ Calder never should have taken Hollow Fork Road that night, but the interstate had backed up for miles behind a jackknifed trailer, and the dispatcher on his radio had assured him the back roads through Merrow County would shave nearly an hour off his route. He had driven through rural Indiana for 11 years and had never once feared a stretch of pavement the way he feared, almost from the first mile, the narrow gravel shoulder and leaning fence posts of Hollow Fork Road that night. The fog came up thick from the drainage ditches on either side, rolling across his headlights in slow pale waves, and somewhere around the second-mile marker his radio cut to static, every station dissolving into the same low, droning hum. He slowed the truck, telling himself it was simply old wiring or a dead zone between towers, and that was when he saw the eyes. They sat low at first, the height of a large dog crouched in the ditch grass, 2 points of dull red light that did not reflect his headlights the way an animal's eyes should but burned instead with their own dim, steady glow. Then, as his truck rolled past, the shape rose. It rose the way nothing with 4 legs should ever rise, unfolding upward onto 2 hind legs with a wet, cracking sound that Russ would later swear he could still hear in his sleep, and it began, almost lazily, to lope alongside his trailer at a speed that should have been impossible for anything built like a hound. Russ Calder's truck was found the next morning, engine still idling, driver's door hanging open, no blood, no struggle, and no sign of Russ Calder anywhere along that stretch of road or the fields beyond it. His coffee cup sat undisturbed in the center console, still faintly warm when the first deputy arrived. Dana Pruitt had been a volunteer EMT in Merrow County for 6 years, long enough that she no longer flinched at car wrecks, drownings, or the occasional farm accident that left her scrubbing things out of her uniform she preferred not to think about afterward. She was the 3rd unit to arrive at Russ Calder's abandoned truck that morning, called in not because anyone expected to find a patient but because county protocol required medical personnel on scene for any report involving a missing person along Hollow Fork Road. She noticed, walking the perimeter the deputies had taped off, that the frost on the surrounding grass had melted in an oddly precise oval around the truck's position, as though something warm enough to thaw the ground had stood there recently despite the night's hard freeze. She mentioned this to Sheriff Walt Tooley, an older man who had run the county for almost 2 decades, and he told her, a little too quickly, that warm engine exhaust probably explained it, though the truck's engine compartment sat a good 20 feet from the thawed patch she had pointed out. Dana had grown up in Merrow County and had heard, the way every child raised there eventually heard, the old stories about Hollow Fork Road, stories her grandmother used to tell about a hound that walked like a man and ate more than flesh. She had always dismissed them as the kind of tale every rural county kept to scare children away from wandering off after dark. Standing at the edge of that strange thawed oval, she found the dismissal considerably harder to hold on to than it had been the night before. The official search for Russ Calder turned up nothing within the first 48 hours. No body, no clothing, no sign that he had walked into the fields under his own power. Dana joined 2 of the search teams herself, partly out of professional obligation and partly because the thawed patch of grass had settled into her mind like a splinter she could not stop worrying at. She walked the ditches on either side of the road for nearly a mile in both directions, finding nothing more unusual than the ordinary debris of rural roadside, broken bottles, rusted fencing wire, the bones of some long-dead animal scattered by scavengers. It was on the 2nd day of searching that she met Earl Mossback, an old farmer whose property bordered the road's eastern stretch, who approached her cautiously near his fence line and asked, without much preamble, whether the missing trucker's eyes had been found intact. The question struck Dana as strange enough that she asked him directly what he meant by it. Earl told her that in his experience, when the hound got someone clean, the eyes were always the last thing that mattered to it, and that families who lost someone to Hollow Fork Road over the years had learned, eventually, that whatever the hound left behind, if it left anything behind at all, never looked quite right around the eyes. Dana asked him how many people he believed the hound had taken over the years. Earl's answer, delivered without exaggeration or dramatic flourish, simply as a fact he had lived with his entire life, was that he had personally known of at least 9, going back to his own father's time, and that the county's official records, if anyone bothered to check them carefully, would likely show considerably more. That evening, Dana drove to the small county library housed in a converted church building near the courthouse square and asked the elderly librarian, Miss Pearl Atkins, whether the archive kept old newspaper records going back several decades. Miss Atkins, who had worked at that desk longer than Dana had been alive, led her without hesitation to a back room of bound newspaper volumes and microfilm reels, mentioning as she did that Dana was not the first person to come asking about Hollow Fork Road, though she was the first in a long while. Dana spent nearly 4 hours that night paging through old issues of the Merrill County Courier, finding reports of disappearances and unexplained deaths along that same stretch of road dating back, as best she could determine from the inconsistent old record-keeping, to at least the 1890s. The language in the older articles grew increasingly careful and evasive the further back she searched, settling eventually into a familiar pattern of phrases, animal attack, wandered off, presumed lost to the elements, that told her more by what they avoided saying than by what they actually claimed. One article from 1931 caught her attention longer than the others, describing the death of a young farmhand found at the roadside with what the county coroner at the time described, in language unusually direct for the era, as a complete absence of vital animation despite no physical injury sufficient to explain death. The coroner's name, listed at the bottom of the brief article, was Josiah Pruitt, a name Dana recognized immediately as belonging to her own family line, several generations removed. Dana brought the old article home and spent the rest of the night searching through a box of family papers her grandmother had left her years earlier, papers she had never had reason to examine closely until now. Buried near the bottom of the box, beneath letters and photographs spanning several generations, she found a small leather journal, its pages brittle and water-stained, bearing the name Josiah Pruitt inscribed on its inside cover in faded ink. The journal's early entries described an ordinary farming life in Merrill County during the late 1800s, but partway through, the tone shifted abruptly, describing a terrible drought that had threatened to destroy the Pruitt family's land and livestock, and a desperate bargain Josiah had struck, in his own words, with something he met one night at the edge of the property that called itself a keeper of debts and favors. The bargain, as Josiah described it in increasingly anxious handwriting across the following pages, had granted his family protection and prosperity in exchange for a hound that would guard the land and the road bordering it, a hound that required, periodically, a soul offered up willingly or otherwise to maintain its bound nature. Josiah's final legible entry, dated several months after the bargain, expressed growing horror at what he had agreed to and a desperate hope that future generations of his family would find some way to undo what he had set into motion. Dana read Josiah Pruitt's journal 3 more times before morning, each reading sharpening rather than softening the cold dread settling into her chest. If the journal spoke truly, the hound terrorizing Hollow Fork Road for over a century was not some random supernatural predator that had simply chosen the location by accident. It was bound to her own family's land, created by her own ancestors' desperate bargain, and apparently still active well over 100 years later, taking whatever toll it required regardless of whether the original debt had ever been properly settled. She called Earl Mossback the next afternoon, asking him directly whether he had ever heard the name Pruitt connected to the old stories about the hound. Earl's hesitation on the phone line told her plainly that he had, though he seemed reluctant to discuss it directly until Dana told him about the journal she had found. Once she had, his reluctance gave way to a kind of relieved urgency, as though he had been waiting decades for a Pruitt descendant to finally come asking the right questions. He told her that local memory, passed down carefully through a handful of old families who still remembered, held that the Pruitt bloodline carried some kind of binding connection to the hound, a connection that meant the creature would always, eventually, circle back toward Pruitt land and Pruitt blood whenever its hunger grew strong enough, regardless of how many strangers it consumed along the road in between. Dana brought what she had learned to Sheriff Tooley, hoping that even a skeptical lawman might take the pattern seriously once she laid out the decades of disappearances alongside her family's documented history with the road. Tooley listened to her entire account without interrupting, his expression unreadable, and when she finished he told her, quietly, that he had suspected for years that the old stories held more truth than the county's official records would ever admit, but that admitting as much publicly would only invite ridicule and outside scrutiny the county could not afford. He admitted, after some hesitation, that he had personally responded to 4 disappearances along Hollow Fork Road during his own tenure as sheriff, and that in each case he had quietly closed the file as an accidental death or unexplained disappearance rather than pursue an explanation he knew the county commissioners would never accept or fund an investigation into. He told Dana that if she intended to pursue this further, she should do so carefully and largely on her own time, since he could offer her no official support beyond his own private knowledge. Dana left that conversation with a clearer understanding of just how alone she stood in confronting whatever still lurked along that stretch of road, but also with a stubborn, growing resolve that she could not simply let the matter rest now that she understood her own family's responsibility for it. She enlisted the help of Cole Bennett, a younger volunteer firefighter she had worked alongside for the past 2 years and trusted more than most people in the department. Cole listened to her account with considerably more open-minded curiosity than skepticism, admitting that he had grown up 2 counties over hearing similar stories about a different stretch of road, and that he had never fully dismissed such tales the way most people his age tended to. Together they began documenting the pattern of disappearances more thoroughly than Dana had managed alone, cross-referencing old newspaper records against modern missing persons reports and county death certificates, building a timeline that showed disappearances clustering roughly every 7 to 9 years, with smaller, less fatal incidents, animals found drained and lifeless, livestock mutilated without explanation, scattered more frequently in between. Cole pointed out something Dana had missed in her initial research. Not every encounter with the hound along Hollow Fork Road ended in disappearance or death. A handful of older reports mentioned survivors, people who had apparently been bitten but not killed, who had lived on afterward in a state the old articles described only vaguely as changed, withdrawn, or no longer quite themselves. Earl Mossback knew of one such survivor still living, an elderly woman named Opal Greer who occupied a small farmhouse 3 miles from the road's southern end, largely isolated from the rest of the county by both distance and her family's long-standing reluctance to discuss her condition with outsiders. Earl arranged, through a careful series of phone calls to Opal's niece, for Dana and Cole to visit her, though he warned them beforehand that the visit would likely prove unsettling regardless of how prepared they believed themselves to be. Opal Greer sat in a chair by her front window when they arrived, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes tracking their entrance with a slow, deliberate movement that struck Dana immediately as wrong in a way she could not fully articulate. Opal's niece explained quietly that her aunt had been bitten by the hound nearly 40 years earlier, as a young woman walking home from a dance, and had survived the physical wound entirely but had never, in the decades since, displayed anything resembling genuine emotion, curiosity, or apparent awareness of her own continued existence. When Dana gently asked Opal what she remembered about that night, the old woman's answer came slowly, in a flat, distant voice that seemed to originate from somewhere far behind her own eyes. She said only that something had reached inside her chest that night and taken the part of her that used to want things, and that she had spent every day since simply waiting, without particular feeling one way or another, for her body to finally agree to stop continuing. The visit left both Dana and Cole shaken in ways neither of them fully discussed during the drive back into town. Dana found herself thinking more than anything else about the precise phrasing Opal Greer had used, the part of her that used to want things, and recognizing in it confirmation of exactly what the old folklore had always implied about the hound's bite. It did not simply kill. In some cases, it apparently left its victims alive while removing something considerably more essential than mere physical health, leaving behind an empty vessel that continued breathing without any of the substance that had previously animated it. Cole asked her, as they drove past the turn onto Hollow Fork Road itself, whether she believed the hound had killed Russ Calder outright or had instead left him somewhere nearby in the same hollow, soulless condition as Opal Greer. Dana did not have an answer, though the question troubled her considerably more than she let on, raising the uncomfortable possibility that somewhere in the fields and woods bordering that road, other victims across the decades might have simply wandered off in their emptied state rather than ever being found at all. They agreed, by the time they reached town, that they needed direct evidence of the creature itself before they could hope to understand it well enough to stop it, and that gathering such evidence would almost certainly require putting themselves deliberately into its path after dark. They made their first attempt 3 nights later, parking Cole's truck in a pull-off roughly a mile north of where Russ Calder's vehicle had been found, equipped with a thermal camera borrowed from the fire department's equipment locker and a simple voice recorder Dana had purchased specifically for the purpose. The night was clear and unusually cold for the season, the kind of cold that made every sound carry further than it should across the open fields. They waited in tense silence for nearly 2 hours before the truck's interior temperature began dropping in a way the heater running steadily should have prevented, the windows fogging from the inside despite the dry winter air, and Cole's thermal camera, aimed out through the windshield, began picking up a vague heat signature moving along the tree line roughly 200 yards distant, a shape that the camera's display rendered as roughly humanoid but with proportions that made Dana's stomach turn the longer she studied it. The shape paused at the edge of the tree line, and through the truck's windshield, even without the thermal camera, Dana saw 2 points of dim red light flare to life in the darkness, fixed directly on their vehicle with an attentiveness that felt entirely too deliberate to belong to any ordinary animal. Cole started the truck's engine immediately, his hands steady despite the obvious fear in his voice as he suggested they had seen enough for one night. Dana agreed, though she found herself unable to look away from the red eyes still watching them from the tree line even as Cole shifted the truck into reverse. The shape began moving toward them across the open field at a pace that started deceptively slow and then accelerated with a suddenness that made Cole swear under his breath and press the accelerator harder than the gravel pull-off's loose surface comfortably allowed. In the rearview mirror, Dana watched the creature close the distance with a horrifying, fluid speed despite its unnatural 2-legged posture, its long hound-like head low and forward, its red eyes never wavering from their fleeing vehicle. It came near enough, just before Cole reached the paved road and accelerated fully away, that Dana caught a clear glimpse of its face in the truck's taillights, a hound's elongated muzzle and pricked ears set above a torso and limbs that moved with disturbingly human articulation, its dark fur matted in patches that looked, in the brief red glow of the taillights, suspiciously like old dried blood. They did not speak again until they reached the edge of town, both of them breathing hard, the thermal camera and voice recorder forgotten on the truck's floorboard. Having captured, they would discover later, nothing more than confused static and the distorted sound of their own panicked breathing. Dana returned to Josiah Pruitt's journal with renewed urgency the following day, searching its later pages more carefully for any mention of how the original bargain might be undone or at least managed safely. She found, near the journal's final entries, a brief and frustratingly incomplete reference to a binding made at the time of the original bargain, an object Josiah described only as the collar, which he claimed could restrain the hound's hunger when properly maintained but which he had apparently lost or hidden sometime before his death, the journal offering no clear indication of its eventual location. She brought this detail to Earl Mossback, who confirmed that he had heard similar fragments of the old story from his own father, including a vague claim that the original collar, blessed or cursed depending on who told the tale, had once been kept somewhere on Pruitt land before passing, through circumstances Earl could not clearly recall hearing explained, into the keeping of the old church congregation that had served the county since its earliest founding. That church, Earl told her, no longer held regular services but still stood at the edge of town, maintained loosely by a small group of elderly caretakers and presided over, on the rare occasions a service was held, by a retired minister named Reverend Amos Caldwell, who Earl believed might know considerably more about the collar's current location than anyone else still living in Merrow County. Reverend Caldwell received Dana and Cole in the small church's back office, a cramped room lined floor to ceiling with old religious texts and county historical records that had clearly been accumulating undisturbed for decades. He listened to their account with the calm, unsurprised patience of a man who had spent his entire ministry quietly aware of something most of his congregation preferred not to discuss directly, and when they finished, he rose without comment and led them to a locked cabinet behind the office's main bookshelf. Inside the cabinet, wrapped in faded velvet cloth, lay a heavy iron collar, its surface etched with symbols that Dana did not recognize but that Reverend Caldwell identified, after a moment's careful study, as a blend of old protective scripture and considerably older symbols whose original meaning had likely been lost even to the congregation members who first inherited the collar generations earlier. He explained that the collar, according to church records passed down alongside it, had been forged at the time of Josiah Pruitt's original bargain specifically to bind the hound's hunger, requiring periodic renewal of its protective inscriptions through a specific ritual that the church's founding congregation had performed faithfully for several decades before. Gradually, as memory of the hound's true danger faded into mere local legend, the ritual had simply stopped being performed at all. Reverend Caldwell explained the ritual's requirements as best he understood them from the old records, a combination of specific scripture recited at the collar's location near Pruitt Land, performed during a particular phase of the moon, alongside a binding gesture that required, troublingly, a willing offering of blood from someone carrying the original Pruitt bloodline, a detail that made Dana's stomach tighten with the understanding that this responsibility had apparently always been meant to fall, eventually, on someone exactly like her. He warned them that the ritual's records grew increasingly fragmentary toward their end, suggesting that whoever had last attempted to perform it, sometime in the early 1960s according to the dated notation in the margin, had done so incompletely or incorrectly, a failure that might well explain the renewed pattern of disappearances Dana had documented in the decades since. Dana asked him directly whether he believed the ritual, performed correctly this time, could permanently end the hound's threat or whether it would only temporarily restrain a hunger that would eventually need renewing again regardless of how carefully they performed it. Reverend Caldwell's answer was honest rather than reassuring. He told her that nothing in the old records suggested the bargain itself could ever be fully undone, only managed, generation after generation, by whoever in the Pruitt line proved willing to accept that ongoing responsibility. Cole offered to accompany Dana for the ritual itself, despite Reverend Caldwell's careful warning that the hound, sensing an attempt to renew its binding, might grow considerably more aggressive in the days leading up to any attempt, a danger the old records hinted at without explaining fully. Dana hesitated to accept his help, given everything she now understood about the personal nature of the Pruitt bloodline's obligation, but she also recognized, practically, that she could not safely manage the location, the timing, and her own vulnerability during the ritual entirely alone. They settled on a date roughly 2 weeks out, the next night the moon would reach the phase Reverend Caldwell's record specified, giving them time to prepare both physically and mentally for whatever the ritual might require of them. Dana spent those 2 weeks studying the old scripture passages until she could recite them without hesitation, while Cole worked with Earl Mossback to identify the exact original boundary line of Pruitt Land, since the property itself had passed through several owners over the decades and no longer matched the original deed's description precisely. In the final days before the chosen night, both Dana and Cole noticed an unmistakable escalation in the hound's activity across the county, livestock found dead and drained on 3 separate farms, 2 more reports of strange figures glimpsed along Hollow Fork Road after dark, and a growing, unspoken tension among the older residents who understood, even without being told directly, that something significant was approaching. 3 nights before the planned ritual, Cole insisted on driving the stretch of Hollow Fork Road alone after his evening shift, intending only to assess current conditions near the original Pruitt boundary line in preparation for their attempt. Dana learned what happened only the following morning, when Cole failed to report for his shift and his worried mother called the fire station asking whether anyone had heard from him. His truck was found pulled neatly onto the gravel shoulder near the boundary line he had gone to scout, engine off, keys still in the ignition. Cole himself slumped against the driver's door, alive but unresponsive, a series of deep puncture wounds visible along his forearm where something with considerable jaw strength had clearly bitten down hard enough to break skin without severing the limb entirely. Dana reached the hospital before the ambulance had even finished unloading him, and the sight of Cole's vacant, unfocused stare, so disturbingly similar to the expression she had seen on Opal Greer's face weeks earlier, told her immediately, with sick certainty, exactly what had happened to him during whatever encounter had left him bitten but breathing along the roadside. The hospital's doctors found nothing medically explainable in Cole's condition beyond the physical wound itself, which responded to ordinary treatment without complication, but his mental state remained exactly as flat and distant as Opal Greer's had been for the past 4 decades. He answered direct questions in a slow, hollow voice, but volunteered nothing on his own, showed no recognition of urgency or fear, and stared at Dana, when she visited his bedside, with an expression that held no warmth despite their years of friendship and shared work. Dana confronted Reverend Caldwell immediately, demanding to know whether the old records offered any method for restoring what the hound's bite had taken, rather than simply binding the creature itself going forward. Caldwell admitted, reluctantly, that the records contained a single brief reference to such a restoration being possible, though only, according to the fragmentary notation, if the binding ritual itself were completed successfully and the collar's full power restored before the missing portion of the victim's soul could be fully consumed or absorbed elsewhere. This gave Dana a narrow but genuine hope and a renewed, desperate urgency to ensure the ritual succeeded, not only to protect the county from future losses but specifically to give Cole a chance at recovering whatever the hound had taken from him during that brief, brutal encounter along the roadside. Earl Mossback, upon learning what had happened to Cole, insisted on joining Dana for the ritual itself rather than allowing her to attempt it with only Reverend Caldwell's guidance from a distance. He told her plainly that he had spent his entire life watching the hound take from families across the county without ever once being in a position to help, and that he intended, regardless of the personal risk involved, to stand beside her when she finally confronted the consequences of his decades of helpless witnessing. Reverend Caldwell, despite his advanced age, also insisted on attending in person, explaining that the ritual's scripture portions required, according to the old records, a properly ordained voice to carry their full protective weight, a requirement he did not fully understand the mechanics of but was unwilling to risk omitting given how much now depended on the attempt succeeding cleanly on the first try. The three of them spent the final 2 days before the ritual gathering everything the old records specified: the iron collar itself, a length of consecrated rope to mark the binding circle, candles blessed according to the church's older traditions, and a small ceremonial blade Reverend Caldwell produced from the same locked cabinet that had held the collar, explaining that it would be needed for the blood offering the ritual required from Dana directly. They drove out to the original Pruitt boundary line on the appointed night, the moon hanging low and pale above the bare winter trees exactly as Reverend Caldwell's calculations had predicted, and Dana felt a deep, bone-level dread settling over her as they unloaded their supplies near the spot Earl had identified, weeks earlier, as the precise location of the original homestead where Josiah Pruitt had struck his desperate bargain more than a century before. The air around the site felt subtly wrong from the moment they arrived, colder than the surrounding fields without any obvious explanation, and the ordinary night sounds of the rural county, distant dogs barking, the occasional passing car on the main road a mile off, seemed to fade into an unnatural, expectant silence the closer they worked to setting up the ritual circle exactly as the old records described. Reverend Caldwell began the scripture recitation just after midnight, his voice carrying with surprising strength across the still, frozen field, and Dana, kneeling within the consecrated rope circle with the ancient collar laid before her, felt the ground beneath her knees begin to tremble faintly, as though something deep beneath the soil had finally noticed, after generations of inattention, that someone was once again paying the debt its proper respect. The hound arrived before Reverend Caldwell finished the first full passage of scripture, emerging from the tree line at the field's far edge with a low, rolling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself rather than simply travel through the air. Its red eyes fixed immediately on Dana, kneeling within the circle, and it began advancing across the frozen field with the same horrifying, accelerating gait she remembered from her first encounter weeks earlier, its dark, matted fur catching the moonlight in patches that looked wet and recently fed. Earl moved to intercept it with a length of iron fence post he had brought specifically for this possibility, planting himself between the approaching creature and the ritual circle with a steadiness Dana found genuinely remarkable given his advanced age and the obvious terror behind his eyes. The hound did not slow for him, however, and the collision when it finally reached him sent Earl sprawling hard against the frozen ground, the fence post knocked uselessly aside, though the impact seemed to cost the creature a moment's hesitation it had not shown in either of Dana's previous encounters. Reverend Caldwell did not stop reciting despite the chaos unfolding only yards away, his voice growing louder and more urgent as he pushed through the scripture's remaining passages, and Dana, understanding that the ritual's success now depended on her holding her position regardless of what happened around her, forced herself to remain kneeling within the circle, the ceremonial blade trembling in her grip as she waited for the moment Caldwell's recitation would call for her own part in the binding. The hound reached the edge of the consecrated rope circle and stopped abruptly, as though striking an invisible wall, its red eyes burning with frustrated fury as it paced back and forth along the circle's boundary, snapping its elongated jaws at the empty air separating it from Dana. She understood, watching this, that the old protections embedded in the ritual still held at least some power even before the collar's full binding had been restored, and the small relief this gave her steadied her hands enough to continue holding her position as Reverend Caldwell's recitation built toward its climax. He called out, finally, the passage that required her own participation, and Dana drew the ceremonial blade across her palm exactly as the old records had described, letting several drops of her blood fall directly onto the iron collar resting before her. The collar's etched symbols flared briefly with a faint, sourceless light at the contact, and the hound's pacing along the circle's edge faltered, its furious growling shifting suddenly into something that sounded, disturbingly, almost like recognition. It spoke then, in a voice that grated and rasped like grinding stone, the first words Dana had ever heard it produce, addressing her directly by a name that was not quite her own but close enough to send ice through her veins. It called her Josiah's blood, and it told her, in halting ancient phrasing, that it had waited a very long time for someone of her line to finally come and pay what generations before her had so carelessly neglected. Reverend Caldwell, startled by the creature's sudden speech, lost his place in the recitation for several crucial seconds, and the hound, seizing the opening, surged forward against the circle's boundary with renewed force, the invisible barrier flickering visibly under the impact like a pane of glass beginning to crack. Dana realized, with rising panic, that the binding would not hold much longer without the ritual's completion, and she shouted at Caldwell to continue, her own voice cracking with fear she could no longer fully suppress. Earl, recovering from his earlier fall, dragged himself back toward the circle's edge, blood running from a gash along his forehead, and began reciting, in a shaky but determined voice, the portions of scripture he had memorized over the preceding weeks alongside Dana, supplementing Caldwell's faltering recovery with whatever fragments he could remember clearly enough to speak aloud. Together, their combined voices seemed to steady the weakening barrier, and the hound's next assault met resistance solid enough to throw it backward several feet, landing hard on the frozen ground with a sound between a yelp and a furious roar. Dana pressed her bleeding palm flat against the collar's cold iron surface, completing the gesture the old records described as necessary to seal the binding, and felt something shift deep within the ground beneath her, a vast, reluctant settling, as though whatever force the hound answered to had finally, grudgingly, acknowledged the debt being repaid. The collar in Dana's hands grew suddenly warm, then hot, glowing along its etched symbols with a steady golden light that spread outward across the frozen ground in a widening circle, and the hound, caught within the expanding glow, began to howl in a tone that mixed fury with something that sounded, unexpectedly, almost like relief. Its struggling form seemed to shrink slightly within the light's reach, its posture folding gradually back toward something closer to a natural hound's four-legged stance, though its red eyes never lost their burning intensity even as the rest of it diminished. Reverend Caldwell finished the final passage just as the golden light reached its widest point, and the moment his last word left his lips, the light collapsed inward all at once, drawing the hound's shrinking form with it in a rush of displaced air that knocked all three of them backward off their feet. When Dana managed to lift her head from the frozen ground, the field lay empty and silent before her, the hound nowhere in sight, the only remaining trace of the entire confrontation a faint, lingering warmth rising from the patch of earth where the creature had last stood. She looked down at the collar still gripped tightly in her bleeding hand and found its etched symbols now glowing with a faint, steady light of their own, no longer cold dead iron but something subtly, permanently changed by whatever binding had just passed through it. They drove Earl and Reverend Caldwell directly to the hospital despite both men's exhausted protests that their injuries amounted to nothing serious, and Dana herself submitted to having her palm properly bandaged only after the attending nurse threatened to refuse discharge papers otherwise. While the doctors tended to Earl's forehead gash, Dana slipped away to Cole's room, the glowing collar wrapped carefully in cloth and tucked beneath her jacket, uncertain whether what she had just completed would have any effect on his hollow, distant condition but unwilling to wait until morning to find out. She found Cole sitting up in his bed, staring blankly at the muted television mounted on the opposite wall, his expression as flat and unresponsive as it had been every time she had visited since the attack. She unwrapped the collar carefully and held it close to him, uncertain exactly what she expected to happen, and watched as the faint golden glow along its symbols brightened briefly upon contact with his skin, the light passing into him in a way that reminded her, uncomfortably, of watching something pour from one container into another. Cole blinked slowly, his expression shifting for the first time in days, his eyes finally settling on Dana's face with something that looked unmistakably like genuine recognition. He asked her, in a voice rough with disuse but unmistakably his own again, how long he had been gone. Cole's recovery over the following days proved gradual but genuine, his emotional responses returning piece by piece, his memory of the events leading up to his attack slowly reconstructing itself as the disorientation faded. He told Dana, once he felt strong enough to discuss it clearly, that he remembered almost nothing of the actual bite itself, only a sensation of being pulled sideways out of his own body, watching from somewhere distant and indifferent as his physical form continued breathing and moving without him fully inhabiting it. Opal Greer's family, hearing through the county's tight-knit gossip network that something had changed for Cole Bennett following his attack, reached out cautiously to ask whether Dana believed a similar restoration might be possible for their own aunt after 4 decades of hollow existence. Dana visited Opal again, bringing the collar with her, and pressed it gently against the old woman's hand exactly as she had done with Cole. The change in Opal proved less complete than Cole's recovery, perhaps owing to the decades that had passed since her original attack, but her niece reported, in the weeks that followed, a noticeable warmth returning to her aunt's expression, small moments of apparent contentment or mild irritation that the family had not witnessed from her in longer than most of them could remember. Dana understood in the weeks following the ritual that her responsibility toward the hound and the collar had not truly ended but had instead simply shifted into a new, ongoing form. Reverend Caldwell explained, once he had recovered enough to discuss the matter calmly, that the binding they had performed would likely hold for a generation or more given how thoroughly it had been completed, but that eventually, just as Josiah Pruitt's original bargain had required ongoing maintenance that previous generations had neglected, someone would need to renew the ritual again to keep the hound properly restrained. She decided, after much consideration, that she would not allow the same neglect that had cost the county so many lives across the decades to happen again under her own watch. She began keeping detailed records of everything she had learned, the journal entries, the ritual's exact requirements, the collar's current location and condition, intending to ensure that whoever in her family eventually inherited this responsibility after her would have considerably more guidance than she herself had been given. She also made a point of speaking openly, within the careful limits Reverend Caldwell advised, with other members of the extended Pruitt family scattered across the surrounding counties, gauging which of them might prove receptive to understanding and eventually sharing this ongoing burden rather than leaving it to fall, generation after generation, on whichever single descendant happened to stumble into the truth by accident. Sheriff Tooley, upon learning the full outcome of Dana's confrontation, expressed quiet, genuine relief, though he remained adamant that the county's official records would continue describing Russ Calder's disappearance and the handful of other unresolved cases from recent years as exactly that, unresolved, rather than risk the kind of public scrutiny that an honest explanation would inevitably invite. Dana found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, largely in agreement with his caution, having seen firsthand how poorly most people processed truths that fell so far outside ordinary explanation. She did, however, insist on one change to the county's handling of future incidents along Hollow Fork Road, convincing Tooley to quietly authorize a small, informal advisory role for herself whenever similar cases arose in the future, ensuring that her particular knowledge would not simply be dismissed or overlooked the way her own initial concerns had nearly been dismissed by the department before Earl Mossback's intervention. Thule agreed to this arrangement readily enough, admitting that having someone within the department who genuinely understood what occasionally happened along that stretch of road struck him as considerably more useful than continuing to pretend the county's old folklore held no practical relevance to his actual duties. 3 months after the ritual, Dana drove out to Hollow Fork Road alone for the first time since the binding, parking near the spot where Russ Calder's truck had been found and walking the stretch slowly in the late afternoon light, no longer feeling the same instinctive dread that had gripped her on every previous visit. The road looked, in the ordinary daylight, exactly like every other quiet rural stretch in Merrow County, lined with bare winter trees and weathered fence posts, betraying nothing of the violence it had witnessed across more than a century. She found herself thinking about Josiah Pruitt, her distant ancestor, and the desperate fear that must have driven him to strike his original bargain so many generations earlier, watching his family's land and livelihood threatened by a drought he had no other way to survive. She did not excuse what his choice had ultimately cost so many innocent strangers across the decades that followed, but she found, walking that quiet road in the fading afternoon light, that she understood his desperation considerably better than she once might have. She stopped at the precise location of the original homestead boundary, now marked discreetly by a small stone Earl had helped her place there, and stood for a long moment in silence, feeling the same faint, settled warmth she had noticed rising from the ground on the night of the binding, a quiet reassurance that whatever debt her family had once incurred now rested, at least for the time being, in a state of careful, hard-won balance. Cole returned to active duty with the fire department within the month, his recovery complete enough that most of his coworkers noticed nothing unusual about his demeanor beyond a slightly more serious cast to his sense of humor than he had carried before the attack. He and Dana grew considerably closer in the months that followed, bonded by an experience neither of them could ever fully explain to anyone outside their small circle of people who understood exactly what had happened on Hollow Fork Road that winter. He asked her, one evening as they sat together on the porch of her grandmother's old farmhouse, whether she ever worried about the possibility that the binding might fail before she managed to properly pass the responsibility along to someone else in the family. Dana admitted that the worry never fully left her, but that she had decided, after everything she had survived and witnessed, that living with that ongoing responsibility honestly was considerably better than the alternative her own ancestors had chosen, generations of careless neglect that had cost the county so many lives in the long silence between each forgotten obligation. She told Cole that she intended to keep careful watch over Hollow Fork Road for the rest of her life if necessary, and to make absolutely certain that whoever eventually inherited the collar and the journal after her understood exactly what was being asked of them, rather than discovering the truth the same hard way she had, through fear, loss, and a long winter of desperate, dangerous work. Word of the strange events surrounding Hollow Fork Road inevitably spread, in the careful, half-whispered way such things always traveled through a small rural county, and Dana found herself, over the following year, approached occasionally by curious strangers who had heard fragments of the story through online forums dedicated to local legends and unexplained disappearances. She declined every interview request and every invitation to discuss the matter publicly, understanding clearly by now how poorly the full truth would survive translation into the kind of sensational, disbelieving coverage such stories typically attracted. She did, however, maintain a careful private correspondence with a handful of researchers and historians who approached her respectfully, sharing limited portions of what she had learned in exchange for their own research into similar bound entities reported in other rural counties across the Midwest, gradually building a picture of a phenomenon considerably more widespread than she had ever imagined during her own desperate weeks of investigation. One correspondent in particular, a folklorist from a state university 3 hours away, mentioned in passing that he had documented at least 6 other counties across Indiana and the surrounding states with remarkably similar legends, hounds or wolves that walked unnaturally, bargains struck generations earlier by desperate landowners, and bindings that required periodic, careful renewal by descendants who rarely understood what they had inherited until circumstances forced the knowledge upon them exactly as it had been forced upon Dana herself. This correspondence troubled Dana considerably, raising questions she had not previously considered about whether the entity bound to her own family's land represented an isolated, singular bargain or instead some smaller piece of a much larger, older pattern that stretched across the entire region, perhaps even further. She raised the question with Reverend Caldwell, who admitted that the old church records, fragmentary as they were, had occasionally referenced other congregations in neighboring counties maintaining similar old bindings, though direct cooperation or communication between these scattered keepers had apparently lapsed generations earlier as each community's specific knowledge faded into vague, half-remembered folklore. She began to wonder whether re-establishing some of those older connections might prove valuable, both for her own ongoing responsibility toward the Hollow Fork Road binding and for the broader pattern her folklorist correspondent had begun documenting. Reverend Caldwell encouraged the idea cautiously, noting that whatever force had originally extracted these bargains from desperate landowners across multiple generations and multiple counties likely operated according to some larger logic that no single isolated family, working alone and in secret, could ever hope to fully understand. Dana did not pursue this broader investigation immediately, recognizing that her more urgent responsibility remained close to home, ensuring the Hollow Fork Road binding held steady and that her own family understood and accepted the ongoing obligation it now carried. But she kept the folklorist's letters carefully filed alongside Josiah Pruitt's journal, recognizing that the full scope of what she had stumbled into might prove considerably larger than the borders of Merrow County alone. Earl Mossback's health began declining steadily over the following 2 years, the old farmer's body finally showing the wear of decades spent quietly carrying knowledge about Hollow Fork Road that he had never been able to fully share with anyone until Dana came asking the right questions. Dana visited him often during those final months, recording as much of his memory and family history as he could offer, understanding that his death would mean the loss of irreplaceable first-hand knowledge about decades of incidents that the county's official records had never properly preserved. Earl passed quietly in his sleep on a cold morning in early winter, and Dana attended his funeral alongside most of the surrounding farming community, recognizing in the gathered mourners several other families whose own histories, she now suspected, held quiet connections to the old road's dark legacy that they had likely never discussed openly with anyone outside their immediate kin. She inherited, through Earl's modest will, a small collection of his own family papers, including several letters from his own father describing encounters with the hound stretching back to the 1920s, adding considerably to the historical record Dana had been carefully assembling since her first night reading through Josiah Pruitt's old journal. Dana married Cole 2 years after the binding, in a small ceremony held at the same old church where Reverend Caldwell had guided them through the ritual that had saved Cole's soul and bound the hound back into its long, uneasy rest. Reverend Caldwell, his health also beginning to fail by then, insisted on officiating the wedding himself despite his family's gentle suggestions that he allow a younger minister to handle the duty, telling Dana privately that he intended to remain useful to the Pruitt family's ongoing burden for as long as his body allowed him the strength to do so. Their first child, a daughter they named Ruth after Dana's own grandmother, arrived 18 months later, and Dana found herself, in the quiet hours of new motherhood, thinking often about the eventual conversation she would need to have with her daughter someday, explaining the family's strange, dangerous inheritance in terms a child could understand without being needlessly terrified by it. She began, even in those early months, keeping a private journal of her own, modeled loosely after Josiah Pruitt's original entries, intending it eventually as a clearer, more complete guide than the fragmentary records that had nearly cost the county so much during her own desperate weeks of discovery, determined that her daughter would never have to face the same frightening uncertainty Dana herself had once navigated almost entirely alone. Reverend Caldwell died peacefully 5 years after officiating Dana's wedding, leaving behind detailed written instructions for his successor regarding the church's old records and the collar's continued safekeeping, instructions that named Dana explicitly as the appropriate authority to consult regarding anything connected to Hollow Fork Road or the Pruitt family's ongoing obligation. The younger minister who eventually took over the small congregation proved considerably more skeptical of the old stories than Caldwell had ever been, but he honored the written instructions faithfully nonetheless, maintaining the locked cabinet and its contents exactly as his predecessor had specified. Dana found herself, in the years following Caldwell's death, increasingly recognized within the small circle of people who understood the truth as the de facto keeper of Merrill County's strangest and most dangerous secret, a role she had never sought but had come, gradually, to accept as an inseparable part of who she had become since that first cold morning standing beside Russ Calder's abandoned truck. She continued working as an EMT throughout these years, finding that her ordinary professional duties offered a steadying, practical counterweight to the stranger responsibilities she carried privately, and she made certain, whenever a call came in involving Hollow Fork Road, to respond personally rather than allowing a colleague unfamiliar with the road's true history to handle the situation alone. Ruth grew up hearing careful, age-appropriate versions of the family's history from an early age, her mother gradually revealing more complete details as she matured enough to understand them without undue fear, and by the time Ruth reached her early teenage years, she had developed a calm, practical familiarity with the family's unusual responsibility that reminded Dana, with a mixture of pride and quiet apprehension, of her own gradual acceptance of the same burden years earlier. Dana began, when Ruth turned 16, formally teaching her daughter the scripture passages and ritual gestures the original binding had required, explaining honestly that the protection they had established would eventually need renewing again, likely sometime within Ruth's own adult lifetime if the patterns documented across previous generations held true. Ruth absorbed this responsibility with a seriousness that occasionally worried Dana, wondering whether she was asking too much of a child still finding her footing in an otherwise ordinary modern life. But Ruth reassured her mother, during one particularly emotional conversation on the subject, that she did not resent the inheritance the way Dana sometimes feared she might. She told her mother that understanding the truth from an early age, rather than discovering it suddenly and dangerously as Dana herself had been forced to, felt like a gift rather than a burden, even given everything dangerous the knowledge ultimately implied for her own eventual future. Sheriff Tooley retired from his position 8 years after the binding, and his eventual successor, a younger officer who had grown up in a neighboring county with no direct family connection to Merrill County's old folklore, initially proved resistant to continuing the informal advisory arrangement Dana had established with Tooley regarding incidents along Hollow Fork Road. It took 2 separate unexplained incidents, neither severe enough to draw outside attention but both unmistakably consistent with the older pattern, before the new sheriff reluctantly agreed to maintain the same quiet cooperation his predecessor had established. Dana found these periodic, smaller incidents, livestock occasionally found drained, strange lights or shapes glimpsed by isolated travelers after dark, troubling reminders that the binding, however thoroughly performed, had not eliminated every trace of the hound's lingering presence along that stretch of road. Reverend Caldwell's successor, after careful consultation with Dana, suggested that these smaller occurrences likely represented the natural strain of a powerful binding gradually settling into its long-term equilibrium rather than any sign of imminent failure, but Dana made a point of monitoring each incident carefully regardless of the reassurance. She updated her own private journal faithfully after every report, building year by year, an increasingly detailed record that she hoped would prove invaluable to whoever eventually needed to perform the next renewal, whether that fell to Ruth in her own adult lifetime or, if circumstances allowed the current binding to hold longer than the historical pattern suggested, to some further descendant Dana herself would never live to meet. A particularly severe incident roughly 15 years after the original binding tested Dana's careful management more thoroughly than anything since the original confrontation. A teenage couple parked along a quiet stretch of Hollow Fork Road reported, in a frightened call to the sheriff's office, glimpsing a tall, 2-legged shape with glowing red eyes moving along the tree line near their car, close enough that they had fled the scene at considerable speed rather than wait to confirm what they had seen. Dana responded personally, accompanied by Ruth, now 22 and fully trained in her own right, bringing the collar with them to the location the teenagers had described. They found no direct evidence of the hound itself, but the ground near the tree line showed the same telltale thawed patch Dana remembered noticing around Russ Calder's abandoned truck so many years earlier, a sign she now recognized immediately as confirmation that the creature, however weakened and bound, retained at least some capacity to manifest briefly when conditions allowed. Ruth performed a smaller maintenance ritual at the site, one Reverend Caldwell's old records described as appropriate for minor flare-ups that did not yet require the full renewal procedure, and the thawed patch of ground cooled rapidly back to match its frozen surroundings within minutes of her completing the gestures, confirming that the smaller, less demanding ritual had succeeded in temporarily reinforcing the larger binding without requiring the considerably more dangerous full ceremony. This incident convinced Dana that the full renewal, while perhaps not yet urgently necessary, would likely be required sooner than the original century-long pattern suggested, given how much more frequently these smaller flare-ups had begun occurring as the binding aged. She and Ruth began preparing in earnest for that eventual full ceremony, gathering supplies, studying the old records even more carefully than Dana had managed during her own desperate first attempt, determined to approach the renewal with considerably more preparation and confidence than circumstances had originally allowed. Cole, now well into middle age himself, insisted on being present for whatever eventual ceremony proved necessary, telling Dana and Ruth both that he owed the family a debt he intended to keep honoring for as long as his own strength allowed, regardless of how many decades had passed since the hound's bite had nearly cost him everything that made him who he was. Dana found herself, in these later years, increasingly at peace with the strange shape her life had taken since that first frightened night reading Josiah Pruitt's old journal, no longer viewing the family's burden as a curse inflicted upon her unfairly but instead as a responsibility she had grown into with a hard-won, practical competence that she hoped, sincerely, she had managed to pass along successfully to her own daughter. On quiet evenings, Dana still occasionally drove the length of Hollow Fork Road alone, watching the late sunlight slant gold across the same fields that had witnessed so much fear and loss across more than a century before her own family finally managed to bring the old debt into something resembling a stable, managed balance. The road itself remained, to any ordinary traveler passing through, nothing more than an unremarkable rural stretch of Indiana farmland, its true history known only to the small circle of people Dana had carefully entrusted with the truth over the years. She thought, on these drives, of Russ Calder, whose disappearance had first drawn her into this long, strange responsibility, and of Opal Greer, whose slow, partial restoration had given Dana her first real hope that the damage already done might still be at least partially undone for those willing to keep fighting for it. She thought of Earl Mossback's patient decades of helpless witnessing, and Reverend Caldwell's faithful, quiet stewardship of knowledge most of his congregation preferred never to confront directly. Mostly, though, she thought about the long chain of responsibility now stretching forward through her own daughter and whatever generations followed her, understanding clearly, by this point in her life, that the hound bound beneath that quiet Indiana road would never be fully destroyed, only managed, generation after careful generation, by whoever among her descendants proved willing to remember what the rest of the world had long since forgotten how to fear. If you like this story, and want to hear more, like and subscribe. Or if you want me to make you a custom story, comment down below. See you the next one.